For those of you who have been attending these Zoom meetings or are familiar with my work, you know, certainly a theme is um, emphasizing, how can I put it, kind of the indivisibility of everything, that this idea of the phenomena that are experienced, including the phenomena of being an individual person. That's a phenomena that we experience. Obviously, we do, all of us. That phenomena, when we explore the nature of our experience, when we explore what's here, what's occurring here experientially, which is all we really have to explore, um, we can discover several astonishing things about it that run counter to our conventional notions. And one is, maybe most important and primal, is that we can't actually find separate pieces in the field of experience, even though it shows up as lots of separate phenomena, both subjective, if you will, phenomena and the objects of the world. So we'll explore that, and that tends to be kind of what I often am exploring with people, and there's a lot of reasons for that. But one is that discovering the inseparability of everything, the indivisibility of the experiential field, that there isn't a this and a that. Ultimately, there's this wholeness, seamless expanse. Um, Brings with it all sorts of, you could say, beneficial things along with it, and one is a profound sense of well-being, profound sense of kind of stability. Basically, because one finds when there aren't actually separate pieces in the field of experience, but there's just a seamless whole. One discovers that there's not one thing pushing against another thing. There's not one thing pulling on another thing. There's not one thing in resistance or opposed to another thing. That can only happen when there's separate pieces. Just like the wave ocean metaphor that I often turn to, it's different perspectives. From one perspective, it could look like one wave crashing into another wave, you know, a subject, a human crashing into different waves of experience, you could say, or waves of experience crashing into us. And it can feel like that. I was sharing with Pam a moment ago about my father's dealing with some pretty serious health issues right now. And hopefully I'll be able to finish out the call and not have to attend to something around that, because it's kind of an emergency situation. But um, you know, facing what he's facing as an older adult, he's 88, and what we've all, you know, faced in our own ways in life, can feel as if we're at the mercy of all these circumstances that are occurring to us, bodily things breaking down, illness, mental, emotional states that are difficult to manage. I mean, that's part of the human experience, to be sure. Um, but there's another perspective on all of that. And that's very much what I speak about in these meetings, discovering this other perspective where what appears as separate phenomena happening to us is really only one way to see and experience it. There's another perspective that we can access that's changes the whole equation as far as what it's like to live a human life, what it's like to encounter even great challenge and difficulty. Um, so kind of to get us started, I was going to read a little meditation from this last book of mine. And it takes this idea that we often hear spoken about in meditative disciplines and practices, about where we're kind of trying to control attention in a particular way. We're sort of trying, even if in subtle ways, to move from one thing to another. And then if there's a kind of movement away from whatever it is where we're focused on, we feel we bring attention back to that object. And that's kind of how it's often set up in meditative practices. And I introduce a whole nother notion here. And again, the aim of this is to evoke the recognition of this inseparability, this indivisibility, that there's a singularity here. There's a one ocean of life, one ocean of existence, one ocean of reality that's present right here, that appears as all of this stuff, and can be experienced as different discrete phenomena, to be sure, right? So let's play with this little meditation together, and then we can have some conversation about it. It's called Drifting toward reality. If you've ever practiced meditation, you very likely have received guidance to focus on some aspect of experience, maybe the process of breathing or body sensations. When engaging in such practices, we quickly discover that attention tends to drift from one thing to another, right? This is what attention does, if it's anything like my attention. And when this inevitably occurs, one is typically instructed to keep track of the drifting of attention, and whenever it's noticed, simply redirect the mind back to the chosen object, right? In both psychology and spirituality, the wandering of attention is frequently portrayed as a problem that we must work very diligently to overcome. However, as valid as that perspective might be in certain contexts, I invite you into another consideration. And that is that drifting is what experience actually does, owing to its inherently dynamic, transitory nature. In other words, the effort to try to make attention remain somewhere is a fool's errand, because the nature of reality is not stable. It doesn't stay still. It doesn't stay fixed. I invite you into another consideration, that drifting is what experience actually does, owing to its inherently dynamic nature. The experiential field, which of course includes attention, our attention is an aspect of the field of experience, it's constantly changing, continuously moving from one state to the next, wandering, as it were, from one point of focus to the next. Experience doesn't hold still, it's a shapeshifter. I mean, already, as we've been sitting here, how much has your experience been morphing from one moment to the next? It's incredible, isn't it? It's not holding still. Given this, could it be that the drifting of attentional focus is not the colossal problem it's been made out to be? I realize, of course, that what I'm suggesting here flies in the face of conventional meditative wisdom. But as I said, the very drifting that meditators have struggled for millennia to overcome or keep in check is actually the natural state of things. Drifting away, quote unquote, is, we could say, reality's signature mode. And so in placing ourselves in opposition to this natural tendency, through any degree of mental effort, even if subtle, we may not only be fighting a losing battle, but also reinforcing the notion that some portions of the field of experience are somehow preferable or more real than others. With that in mind, here's a simple practice we can play with. As you sit here, and you can do this with your eyes open or closed, just allow your experience to do what it does. Notice the way in which attention naturally drifts from one point of focus to the next. And just allow it to do that. It's going to do it anyway. Feel the way in which experience moves and wafts and undulates like the tides, shifting moment by moment. And now, as you notice this natural movement, if you suddenly find yourself having seemingly lost contact or being less present with this ceaseless drifting of experience, don't worry. That's just the next place that drifting has taken you. Reality is just doing what reality does, drifting. This is life's nature, to never hold still. Like clouds moving through the vast and spacious sky, we are forever drifting, one state wafting into the next. Some focus of attention appears, some experiential moment comes into view, and then we suddenly find ourselves somewhere else, swept away yet again. But this drifting, this getting swept away, is not some spiritual mistake. It's simply what life does. And so there is no drifting away from reality, for there is only reality, forever drifting into itself. Enjoy the drifting, for there really is nothing else to enjoy. So we can just sit here for a few moments, um, and as you notice this natural undulation, this natural kind of tidal movement of drifting from one sort of, almost as if you're kind of just naturally, attention's just naturally wandering around the field of experience, like encountering whatever it encounters, a momentary flash of thought, a stream of wondering, a memory, a visual image, a felt sense of energy in the body. I mean, it's endless, right? The places where something comes into view, and then whatever is being viewed slips away, and then another thing comes into view. Just notice that, how natural that is. And no, there's no need to make any effort to make that other than it is. Just let experience do what it does, which is change constantly. And as you notice this natural drifting, the transformation, the constant unfolding, and the constant becoming, in the constant coming into view of another view, another experience, another moment, another flavor, another texture, another quality, just this constancy of this drifting and change. Notice that there's a commonality to everything that's encountered. We could call it the presence of it, the beingness of every place that we may find ourselves drifting. We may find attention drifting. The reality of it, the actuality of it, the here and nowness of it. You could also say the knowing of it. Wherever the drifting takes us, there is the knowing of that, inseparable from it. So the knowing is constant. The beingness is constant. The here-ness is constant. The presence of it is constant, even though it's always new, always different, always distinct. It's like a singular expanse of presence, boundless, limitless, a field, but a field with no edge to it. At least no edge that can be found. And so wherever we may seemingly travel to in this vast, edgeless field of presence, of beingness, of this knowing, we never depart from the field of presence. We're never cast out of this field of presence, because there's nowhere that we could go other than the field of presence. If we were, quote unquote, cast out of the field of presence, well, that's what would be present. The experience of seemingly being cast out of presence. But of course, that's more presence. That's what I mean by there is only the field of presence. And so there's no need to favor one part of the field over another, no need to privilege one aspect of the field of presence, the field of experiencing over another, because it's all the presence of reality. Every thought, every feeling, every sensation, every memory, every image, everything. The field of this vast, boundless, limitless field of presence is all that exists, and is inclusive of everything that may appear and does appear in each instant. Each thing that comes into view, something's coming into view right now, is the view of, it's how presence looks right there in that moment, just like that. And then another picture comes into view, another sound comes into view, another feeling comes into view, another thought comes into view, all these labels we have. And that's presence coming into view. And looking like that version of presence. And then another version of presence. Always the presence, this singularity. Presence is like the color blue pervading the whole sky of experiencing. It just pervades. It is inseparable from all that's experienced, the presence of it. You could say that's the fundamental nature of every moment, is its presence, isn't it? Its existence, its actuality. And there's no possibility of ever gaining this presence or losing it. So no wave of experience ever departs from the ocean of presence. So there's just the ocean of presence, actually. Completely at rest with itself, completely being itself. No, not opposing any aspect of itself, because it's inseparable from all of its wave-like appearances. So there's complete ease and equanimity in this vast, seamless expanse of presence. This is reality. This is the reality of this moment. This is not philosophy. This is our actual experience right now, is that. No lines of division to be found anywhere. No this versus that, or this opposed to that, but just this seamless expanse of presence. And as we open it up to have some conversation around this, that I'm inviting you to explore and discover and feel the reality of it. In a very real sense, just as I was describing, nothing has changed. We might go into, you could say, a different mode of conversation and dialogue, but that is how presence is showing up, as dialogue and discussion and conversation. It's still presence. Being quote unquote still and quiet and meditative is no more presence than having conversation and dialogue. Just a different flavor. Anyway, I'd be happy to um, open it up for anyone who might want to share about how this is striking you. What's happening for you? Where is this landing in you, or maybe not landing as clearly in you? Any questions that you have? Um,
Well, just what you said in the beginning, John, about letting drifting occur,
mhm.
that, you know, is paramount because, the vast majority of my life, um, it felt wrong. When meditation meant you sit and you focus and you don't let your attention and watch your thoughts and keep it, focus. And it's like a straitjacket. And I was never successful at it. And I didn't get it. So it's so freeing to get now that drifting is okay.
Right.
That in itself is just so refreshing. And it makes sense too. It's just, life is meditation. Just what you're saying, it's just liberating. So that's one thing I wanted to share.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's beautifully said. And as you know, because you've been exploring this stuff that I talk about, quite a bit, and that even what we call drifting, this is another sort of interesting inquiry, is to look at the thing we're calling drifting. And what is that experience? Well, what is it? It's impossible to say what it actually is. And yet we have a word for it. It's called drifting. And then somehow not drifting is like another thing that we seemingly can describe. But again, one of the things that both of those, like fixing attention versus drifting of attention, we can describe them as phenomena, seemingly. But when we go to investigate those phenomena, what happens is we come up empty-handed. We can't get to the bottom of what anything is experientially. Which is why in some of the Tibetan traditions, they talk about recognizing what I'm talking about, recognizing the ground of being or awareness is the same as not recognizing it. What does that mean? That sounds like a crazy person speaking. How could they be the same? They're describing polar opposite things, right? But at their basis, what are they? They're the fathomless reality showing up in a particular way we might seemingly be able to describe, but not ultimately able to pull off the descriptions. And that's another very key thing, is to recognize that we can't quietly pull off the describing. We think we can. Consciousness imagines it can accurately convey what's going on. If I try to describe to you, Pam, if you ask me, how are you doing right now, John? Like I could try to describe elements of my experience, right, with words and concepts, but um, I can't put my experience in any kind of cage of words or descriptions, because the experience fundamentally is free of all the cages of words and concepts. It transcends them by its very nature, because it's bottomless, it's infinite, it's indescribable. And so that is another doorway into the same kind of freedom. It's a freedom from all characterizing, the freedom from all frameworks. Drifting, not drifting, who cares? It's all this beautiful, unfathomable reality.
It's interesting too, when during your meditation, this sense or whatever of no lines, no separate. It's just so, I get a sense of the seamlessness of
Mm-hmm.
experience, but it's when something like dramatic happens
Mm-hmm.
that I think it's different somehow. For example, I think,
Mm-hmm.
my cat who died recently, it was like this boulder of grief out there. It just,
Mm-hmm.
what is it about like dramatic shifts that cause this more of a feeling of separation, do you think?
Yeah, I think that you could say sort of karmically, in terms of karma, in the sense of how we're inclined, how you happen to be inclined towards, like you happen to be inclined towards loving cats, let's say, you have an inclination to love animals or whatever it might be. And so the things that we are inclined towards and place particular value on, let's say, we orient very strongly towards those, or consciousness tends to kind of orient very strongly towards those. And so our attention can be very much taken over seemingly by certain elements. And we start sort of emphasizing, like, it's like it becomes much more prominent. It really stands out. It's like suddenly there's a tidal wave, and it's like, you're telling me it's a seamless ocean and all the waves are ultimately the ocean, but shit, now there's this tidal wave happening. Like what I was describing with my dad, it feels like a kind of tidal wave of intensity and drama. And oh my God, it's like COVID is another one of these examples. It's like the intensity of it. It just has this sort of drama, but it's a very human, the drama is driven in part by our tendency to imagine being able to resolve these different waves as being something. In other words, we start imagining that they have independent nature, an independent existence apart from whatever their basis is. We could say their basis is reality, their basis is God, their basis is the source of everything. I mean, who knows what to call whatever it is a moment is arising out of. A thought arises, where does it come from? So that's what I mean by the basis. So whatever everything is arising out of, all experience has its basis in whatever, who knows what that is. But it never departs. It can't ever depart from its basis, right? So the wave, even the biggest tidal waves of grief or sickness or intense emotional pain, they never leave their basis. They never depart from the ocean, actually. They never do. It just seems like, and again, idiosyncratically, maybe based on whatever our particular karmic preferences and tendencies are, and places where suddenly we have a lot of investment in something being a certain way or not being a certain way, let's say, just because of, again, sort of how we happen to be sort of hooked up karmically or as an organism, we will tend to maybe seem to lose sight of that indivisibility and imagine that, oh my God, this wave could definitely like overwhelm me and threaten me. But actually, so partly what we're doing is we're sort of engaging in a kind of remedial retraining of that perspective to realize that is a valid perspective. I mean, it can feel and very much be experienced like we're at the mercy of certain experiences and circumstances, right? But that's only one perspective. And there is this other perspective, which suggests that that's not the only perspective, that there's this other vantage. And that, I mean, if you take something like grief, you and I were talking about it, a couple of weeks ago, that like from one perspective, it feels like I'm a person and this wave of grief is crashing down upon the shores of my being, right? And I feel either overwhelmed by it, or I don't know, I can't make sense of it. It's too much. That's all from a perspective of imagining that somehow there's two things there, me and the grief. But by looking at that more with a little more kind of sensitivity and precision, you could say, feeling into it, you can discover that you can't find a you experiencing something called grief. You just find a flow of experiencing. And it changes the whole nature of the experience. It doesn't mean that there's not grieving still happening, something that we would call grieving. It's not that that necessarily goes away, but it alters, it really transforms the idea of that particular state being a threat.
It seems to me that, what you describe, the mind takes and sees a problem with it, mm-hmm. and tries to solve this indefinability or this boundlessness as a problem that it needs to contain and overcome and mm-hmm. do something about.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's the basic, that's the thing about, and I don't use the word emptiness as I've talked about in the Buddhist idea, but the basic ideas of emptiness is in that tradition is that phenomena that appear to have independent existence don't actually have independent existence. So in normal human parlance, the concept is that there is a thing called a wave that is actually a definable thing that has a separate individual autonomous existence, right? I mean, we even look out at the ocean and we could, well, there's the wave, right? We're defining a separate phenomena, calling it a wave. I was playing around with, let me see if I can pull it up, because maybe I'll just show it to you just for fun, because I was playing with this concept that seems relevant here. Maybe to just show you this, because I think it illustrates the, okay, let me see if I can pull this up. Just take a second here. So here's an ocean, and here's what we would call a wave, like right there, right? Okay. So the question that I'm really posing is, and it's not a philosophical one, it's really an experiential one, because we're experiencing what I'm talking about right now, is, okay, well, how do we make a wave? How do we pull a seeming piece out of the ocean and call it a wave? Well, it's a total abstraction. What do I mean by that? Okay, well, where's the edge of the wave? Where is the wave? Oh, it's right there, you know? So we draw a line, literally, like visually, we draw or consciousness does this. It draws a line there and goes, well, there's the wave. But why do we draw the line there? Like, where is the edge of the wave? How come it's not over here, you know? And how come it's not there? And how come it's not there? It's arbitrary, isn't it? How much of the ocean is the wave? All of it. In other words, there are no waves. There's only an ocean. In other words, in the terminology of emptiness, the wave has no independent existence. It just seems to. And Ed, you know, to kind of your point is that a lot of this does rest upon our kind of fantasy of that we can resolve things as things. And when we explore the things, the phenomena that we encounter in life, either seemingly external or internal to us, we can discover that things are not determinable. They're not resolvable as being things for several reasons. One is we can't find the boundaries of those things, like I'm pointing out here. Like visually, we can't even find them, but we can't find them experientially either. I mean, take any state. Where is the edge of that experience? Like, Pam, if you take the experience of grief, where's the edge of your grief where the grief comes to a stop and the rest of the world begins? It's a continuum. Everything is a continuum. Can't find clear edges or boundaries. So that's one reason you can't resolve things as being things, because you can't find their limits. In order to define something, you have to find the limits of it and put a box around it. And you can't find those limits. Again, that is not philosophy. Go and look and see if you can find them experientially. And I would suggest you can't, which like is the proof of their indefinability. Another proof of the indefinability of phenomena, like the wave, if we use that metaphor, is that this is not how reality is experienced. It's not experienced like a photograph that's holding still, is it? The wave is moving. The waves of experience are moving. So how can you define something that's moving and changing in every instant? Well, you can't. You can't pin it down. So that's another proof of unresolvability, of indefinability. And another is that if you look and you investigate experience, phenomenal experience, you discover that there's too much information there. It's overwhelming, the amount of information, the detail that exists in every phenomena. Just keep looking, and every detail of this moment, investigate the detail of that, and it reveals more detail, which reveals more detail, like a fractal. You just never get to the bottom. I mean, what is it? It just opens up in this kind of infinite way into more and more and more and more and more. Again, another reason why things can't be resolved as being things. That's the end of things. And that's the end of problems too. Problems are defined into existence. From one perspective, yeah. My dad has a problem right now with his health. Like, I'm not going to deny that perspective. And he's in the hospital now to try to resolve that problem. But from the perspective that I'm describing, which is also an equally valid perspective, he is the vast ocean of infinity. And so is his cancer and whatever the other things he's dealing with right now. They are unresolvable as being things, right? And what is it? I mean, look at something like cancer. You could say it's a particular way cells are like proliferating in a way that's not helpful to the organism, right? Well, what are cells? Well, cells are made of, atoms, which are made of subatomic particles, which are made of God knows what. Go down to the bottom, to the root, to the basic nature of everything, and you come up empty-handed. You can't resolve what phenomena are. And yet that unresolvability, that indeterminacy shows up as the magic show of life with all its apparent resolvability. So they're not two separate things. The definability of things and their indefinable nature are not two separate things. It's one reality that can show up as definable, but can be discovered to be absolutely not collapsible into any definitions. And that brings a whole nother that freedom from the definitions of things is truly a freedom. It's truly a realm, if you will, of profound well-being. I mean, that's a description of something that's indescribable, but I'm using words, so. But it's not anything esoteric. It's just your experience right now, just sitting here. There's a meditation in the book called something like sitting on a chair isn't just sitting on a chair. With the most ordinary thing, here I am sitting on a chair. Just what could be more ordinary? And I just described, like, here I am, a person sitting on a thing called a chair. But as an experience, if I feel what's here, not as an idea, because sitting on a chair is an idea. It's not my experience. My experience is my experience. It's not sitting on a chair. And what I call sitting on a chair as an experience is a vast, infinite universe, isn't it? Every single aspect of it, the sensations of the touch sensations, the feeling, the texture of the chair. I mean, what is that? That's a whole universe right there. What is that? The kind of feeling I would describe as a kind of a coolness of this material that I'm touching. What is that? What is coolness? A whole universe. It's astonishing. The most ordinary of experiences are, that's why the book's called This Extraordinary Moment, because the most seemingly ordinary of moments are beyond comprehension. They're extraordinary in that regard. Astonishing and miraculous. I mean, just stare at your hand for a while and notice all the detail there and the texture and how many colors do you see on your hand? You don't have to take LSD to suddenly find yourself tripping. It's unbelievable, It's just, there's a beauty there and a subtlety there and a inconceivable, just amazing. How fun is that? We have constant entertainment right at our fingertips, literally.
It's easier to see this when you're looking at the Northern Lights, for example.
Like the ones behind you?
Right. It's harder looking at a cup, but it's still there.
It's still there, right? Yeah. And that's a peculiar little, but it is there in the cup. And the cups are like the Northern Lights, really, actually. So sometimes we're just sort of, You could say sometimes reality makes that its astonishing, awesome nature more seemingly evident, with something like the Northern Lights or a moment of profound, whatever, intimacy or beauty, but each of the little components that make up like the seeing of color of the Northern Lights. I mean, it's like, again, look at the color of anything and you're seeing something. I think an aspect of it is that something that is so obviously out of the ordinary, of something that's just not ever been seen before and rarely seen visually, like Northern Lights, is like, I'm sitting in a room, it's my father's home here, and how many times have I been in this? We've had this home since 1974. I've been in this room many times, haven't I? So what can happen is we kind of imagine, it's sort of just kind of a habit consciousness has, is of kind of creating this sort of very oversimplified, yeah, I've been here before, it's very familiar to me, right? I've seen it so many times. But if I just stop for a moment, I just look and I'm like, wow, this is the Northern Lights. I've never, all the colors in the room, all the shapes, it's like I could just go on and on and on and on and on, right? So that's the difference between, I talk about this a lot in my work, seeing the way in which our actual experience deviates from what we think is here. So our actual experience of the room is not, or it's not something that you've ever seen before. You have never seen your room that you're sitting in before. So you're not sitting in the same room. In a sense, there is no same. There's just the freshness of this instant.
And along those lines, John, your last Instagram post struck me, where you say, instead of emphasizing how things are appearing, just notice the fact that they are even appearing.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's even another level, that even that, I can see this room. I mean,
Right. Exactly. Right.
like, or even like back to grief, that I can feel grief,
Exactly.
that's even astonishing, that I take it for granted, that I can even experience anything.
Right. That's so spot on, Pam. It's so powerful to feel like, yeah, because it's like you're getting in touch when you turn your attention to experience in that kind of way you're describing. In a sense, you're getting much more in real time, in a sense, like, and the real time is like, wow, this is arising right now inexplicably. Like the appearance is, it's much harder to take it for granted, because it's like, whoa, it's like, what's happening here? Like the whole universe is lit up. The whole moment is lit up and present. And what is it that's present? So, and how is it present? And they're not answerable questions, of course, but somehow the experiential sort of contemplation of the question is profoundly evocative of yeah, it's like you're encountering the unknown, in a sense, the inexplicable, and there's much less sort of, oh yeah, I'm alive and I'm taking, and experiences, something called experience is happening. Like, really? Exactly how is that occurring? Perception. I mean, memory, like, how's memory? What's memory? I mean, really? How are are you doing that? Are you doing memory? Are you sitting in there going, I'm now going to remember the fact that I've seen this person, John Astin, before? I mean, no, but it's being done, isn't it? Memory is being done by the intelligence of reality somehow, inexplicably. And even if you imagined some sort of scenario where science could ultimately explain how it's happening, let's pretend that was even possible. You can see that it's not possible. I mean, how? Oh, well, the way that memory is happening is that the neurons are firing in this particular way. Well, what kind of an explanation is that? It's like, what do you mean they're firing in a particular way? How do they know how to fire in a particular way to create some visual image of something that, I mean, it's absolutely like the mind just explodes, right? I mean, to contemplate this, right? It's just, oh my God. It's like,
So within this unknowable light show, preferences seem to arise.
mm-hmm.
That seems to contract this
Mm-hmm.
unknowability into, I like this, I don't like that.
Mm-hmm.
This is like this is not like that,
Mm-hmm.
etc. That's also a mystery.
It's absolutely a mystery. Um, I mean, I could say I know what a preference is. Like I prefer, I don't know. I prefer health over illness. Okay. To things that I'm describing, or I prefer certain kinds of music over other kinds of music, or I prefer hanging out with certain kinds of people, whatever it might be, right? But again, even a preference itself is not actually something definable either. So, because one would think that if you recognized the sort of the equalness and of the sameness of everything in the sense of its unresolvable, indeterminate, boundless, infinite nature, everything is the same. So why would there even be preferences if you knew that? And yet something called preferences definitely shows up in my experience. And it's just, I have no explanation for that other than there's a kind of one could see that all of this apparent patterning of phenomena, that's another way of understanding the definition, seeming definability of things, is like, oh, well, there's a pattern of things that I call a state of mind called happiness or sadness. Okay, it's like a patterning of whatever energy or phenomena or information. I call them the apparent patterns, because when you go to look for the patterns, you can't find them. It's the patterns of experience are ultimately patternless when you try to get to the bottom of them. And yet I have a preference for, like, I have an idiosyncratic karmic whatever tendency as a creature to prefer certain of the patterns over others. I mean, I don't know why. I just do. But again, there's a real sort of freedom in recognizing that they're just, you can't go wrong in a sense. It's like you don't lose anything by going after a pattern either, like of a preferred, like desire for certain things is not the boogeyman that you have to overcome. It's fine. Desire is one of the ways reality dances, as wanting certain things. What's the problem? It's a very radical notion, that's for sure. And I can appreciate sometimes that it bumps up against, feelings we have as humans that, hey, are you denying that there's like real problems in the world, either personally or interpersonally or societally or globally? No, not denying that from one perspective, there's a pandemic. It's taken, I mean, whatever one might think about it. I mean, my dad can't get a room in the hospital at UCLA Medical Center, one of the best hospitals in the world, because there's too many people in the hospital. So there's something going on, right? Whatever we might think about COVID. But again, from one perspective, it's a light show that's a problem, and we want to do something to try to rectify it so that our lives can return and we can begin doing the things that we love to do, you know, including touching other people and being with other people in a natural way. But what it is more fundamentally is, again, it's an inexplicable light show, like the thing behind you. Yeah. You know, it's and it can be seen that way and understood that way and experienced that way. And that it's as if when we touch that other aspect of particularly difficult, let's say, circumstances, we open ourselves up to another way to understand it, to be with it, to recognize its I was thinking about this the other day. It's almost like there's two worlds that aren't really two worlds, but can show up as two worlds. One is there's a world of potential problems and the solution to those problems. We could call that the imperfect world. But that same seemingly at times less than perfect world is fundamentally absolutely perfect, just as it is. There's not anything wrong or out of place because it's a
John, why do
Hi,
you
Karen.
Hi, thank you. Why do you think that there is a resistance among much of the wider world
Mm.
to viewing things in this way? Much of the world, and science in particular, would say, I will define the waves as peak of the wave to the peak of the wave, or the trough of the wave to the trough of the wave, wave defined.
Right.
And that's a very different way. And I don't think you're denying that definition. You're just looking at it from a different way. But why is it that so much of the world doesn't want to see things in this way that you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a pretty accurate assessment. That it's not a standard view that most people have even ever been exposed to. I mean, when I teach this stuff to my psychology grad students, they're like, I'll say to them, I bet no one's ever said this stuff to you before. And then no, they've never heard this before, ever.
Interesting.
In their 25, 30, 40, 50 years of life. I mean, it's not that known even as a possibility, as a perspective, number one. So I think that's one, but I do think also that even when I do introduce it, it is met with often a sense of some resistance or some confusion or some sense of it's disorienting because it's challenging our familiar frames of reference and our definitions. And you could say as organisms, a part of us seems strongly inclined to want to be able to get a handle on things, to kind of, right, to feel like we have some degree of control and, right, a sense of like, I know what's going down here, you know, I can understand this. And so there's this impulse. And then I come in with something like I'm presenting, and it's like, oh, well, what if there is no handle to get on this? Like doesn't have a handle. It's not knowable in the kind of ways we might hope it would be. It's much more ambiguous and uncertain and ungraspable. That can feel from the perspective of wanting it to have a handle, that can feel very overwhelming and terrifying, maybe even. But I always say to people, or invite them to at least consider, like, if you feel your way into it, you can begin to discover that it's actually turns out to be incredibly comforting to feel that and to begin to get a sense of that, because because it's nourishing, it's empowering, it's
freeing also.
Freeing, absolutely freeing. Yeah.
Because I know that I would, and many people have that desire to have control, but one realizes very often and very frequently that no control.
Absolutely.
and in a way yielding to what is obvious,
right,
is free.
Yeah. And I'm thinking about my sweet dad right now a lot because of his situation that he's in. And in a second, I just need to, speaking of that, I just need to, okay. In a situation of like that, as we grow older, I mean, we've already experienced it to varying degrees, of like the sense of losing control, say, of the body. It's one way to define the aging process, right? And death being, from a bodily standpoint, the ultimate loss of control of, right, of being able to do things with the body and all of that, right? So you can understand, I have more of an appreciation now than ever, having gone through my mom's passing 5 years ago, and now watching my dad over the last couple of years, just navigating the aging process and his eventual passing. How you can see why in some of the traditions they talk about these inquiries as a kind of helpful preparation for navigating those stages of life, because that's when we're really faced with the stark truth of lack of controllability, right? And if we keep trying to have control and certainty when that shit starts to go down as we grow older, typically it can happen earlier, but then it can really be kind of harrowing, right? Because we're pushing against something that's not possible. We don't have that control. So the recognition that we don't have it, and the discovery that it's okay to not have it, is so freeing. It's so freeing to begin to get a sense of that, and opens up access to this other place of like, oh, all fucking hell is breaking loose right now at one level, and at this other level, not as a concept like, oh, I'm okay because I'm being taken care of by the universe concept, as nice as that might feel, but an actual felt sense of the profound perfection and okayness of what's here, is, well, what greater gift could we ever have as a human, to know that in our bones, that no matter what, Pam, there you are in the throes of the grief, the loss of your beloved cat, and like to know at the depths of the depths of the depths of your bones that it's okay, that it's more than okay, that you can have that experience in its full fury, and it's not a threat, actually, because its fundamental nature is the perfection of the universe, is the most profound well-being and infinite. Do you know what I mean? So like knowing that, even just glimpsing that and having a initial taste of that, opens up another possibility of freedom in the midst of all of our experience. That's why I share what I share, in large part, because I'm aware of that possibility of having access to that perspective in our own experience, and it's right here. It's not. It's ours. It is our experience, actually.
Well, and to me, it can also feel like even in those really difficult moments, I had a mother who passed away 5 years ago and a sister who passed away 4 years ago. Very difficult, and yet also incredible privilege to be a part of what was happening in a very intimate, personal, and present way.
It is. It's incredible. It's
Yeah.
just, it's, yeah, there's no words for it really, but absolutely. And, I was thinking about this, and with respect to like navigating the situation that my father's in right now, and thinking about one of the things that makes those kinds of things so difficult, both for the person going through it and the people around them who care about them, is kind of the complex sort of narratives that are swirling around what it is and what's going to happen and how am I going to be able to cope with this, and what's the ultimate outcome going to be, and all of this is like this density of sort of points of view about what's happening, right? And it can be really dizzying and sort of, and I was just sort of feeling into that, and I was feeling of like, okay, so noticing myself and how I can easily go into those narratives of concern and fear, and they're real. There's no need to deny them. But when I come back to like the raw feeling of this moment right now in this instant, like right now in this instant for all of us, right? Like there is no narrative here. I mean, there's just this flash moment, this presence of experiencing, that's timeless, that's evaporates no sooner than it appears. I mean, that's our actual experience. I mean, we can feel that. And in a sense, that there's complete freedom from all the narratives right there, just in, not as an idea, but in the feeling of this moment. In the feeling of this moment, there is no narrative. There's no story. There's no, is there?
Even when there is a narrative, there's no narrative.
Exactly. It doesn't exclude the arising of a narrative, obviously, but it's like it's, yeah, it's just another perspective. It's the turn of the kaleidoscope to feel the way in which narrative, what narrative? There's just this moment. And we do not know what the next moment is going to be. So the narratives are often based on fantasies of what is to come, right? But we don't know what is to come. Even the narrative of our fear of death is a narrative of fantasy. We don't know what death is. We only know this instant.
Like you said earlier, how can you define something that's moving?
You can't. It's sort of like, being with things as they are, being with reality as it is, which is this ever-changing, flash instant, ever-present, aliveness beyond description or characterization. And again, as Ed was saying, though, it doesn't exclude the arising of narratives, because those can appear, and then they are what's, we could say, what's present. Oh, so it's a narrative that's present.
It's like the famous professor that, writes on the board and immediately erases as they go.
Exactly. The Tibetans have all these great metaphors for that, the self-release of the here and now, it's called sometimes, of like a line drawn in water, right? You draw the line in water, and as you're drawing it, it disappears, doesn't it? Or the flight path of the bird in the sky, like it vanishes. I was having a communication with someone about, a great metaphor for that the arrival of this, like a way in which the moment never fully arrives is like, imagine a second hand on a clock going around the clock like an old-fashioned clock, right? It's ticking, 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 and ticking. And let's imagine the number 12 at the top of the clock. So the second hand's, it would make it look like there were these discrete things called a second, like with a bounded time, right? So that's ticking, ticking, ticking. And the flow of time, if we play with the idea of time, is like, it's not something that goes stop, 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 stop. It's moving, right? So the arrival, the second hand never actually can ever arrive at a fixed point in the clock, can it? Because it's moving. So at what point does, in other words, when it gets to 12, it's moving away from 12, isn't it? Is there a point where it stops? It's finally arrived. It's no longer moving towards or away from 12. No, the arriving is the disappearance. That's what the flight path of the bird in the sky means, that the arising of this moment, the arriving of this moment is the departure of this moment, isn't it? It's a single, like birth and death are one. The birth of this moment is the death of this moment. That will explode your mind. But you can feel that, can't you? At this moment, the moment in a very real, actual felt sense, we could say the moment has no duration because it's gone. And yet, curiously, there's this constancy. That's the presence that's always here. not as something separate from all this appearing and disappearing. That's the paradox, is the ever-present presence, actuality that is constant. Something's always here, isn't it? Something's always present, and yet it's passing and arising and passing away and arising and passing away, and yet ever present, ever present. So I call it the stability in the instability. Something's always here, yet always like shifting sands, always falling away, falling away. Amazing. Who came up with this anyway? Who came up with this beautiful, gorgeous, paradoxical? To me, it's beautiful.
Zeno.
Zeno's paradox. Yeah, blame it on Zeno. I mean, really, how reality is seemingly the way that it is, and yet how unfathomable it all actually is. Sorry, were you saying something, Ed? You were kind of cutting out there.
Yeah. Music illustrates this so beautifully.
Hmm. In what way?
Well, you know, we could think of notes as being things, but we only hear the flow. And yet the flow seems to have structure.
Right.
And yet you can't really pin it down.
Exactly. Yeah, I think I was saying on one of the other calls, because I'm also a musician, as some of you know, that you can't really have a song without time in a way. You have to, that's the narrative, is the melody. It's the story of sort of its beginning, its middle, its end, right? It's going somewhere in a sense. It's traveling like through time, the melody. It's not experienced as just flashes of sound with no duration. It's experienced as twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are. That's a narrative. It's a story over time, isn't it? Seemingly. But from another perspective, it's just like there's no explaining it. It's completely beyond comprehension. Like, is there time? Is there no time? Is there just a flash instant? I mean, it's all of the above, none of the above. It's somehow this 0 point, this timeless the 0 point in the sense of the second hand never arrives at 12 and stays there. So in a sense, sometimes they say nothing ever happened. Nothing ever came into form. That's what the Zen, they call it the unborn. Like it's never come into form because it going away. It never takes form completely. And yet it shows up as definite forms, doesn't it? Emptiness is form and form is emptiness, as the Heart Sutra says. And so we can, even though it has this dreamlike, mirage-like nature, that can be discovered to be mirage-like and dreamlike in the sense of ungraspable and indefinable and unresolvable as being something definite, we can enjoy the song. We can enjoy the forms. Can't we?
John, when Karen was asking you about what do you think the reason that this
Mm-hmm.
what we're talking about here is so different in a sense, and we're talking about narratives, and my my experience was I was kind of born into a narrative. I was born into a story
Mm-hmm.
of who I am, what I am, what this world is, what
Mhm.
matter is, and
Mhm.
like really materialistic type paradigm, and
Mhm.
with with a religious twist to it that really,
Mhm.
has a narrative and actually is kind of, you know, taught from a kind of materialistic type
Mhm.
framework too, so it's like it's where it can get confusing to where we
Mhm.
are storytellers, as beings in a sense, and
Mhm.
um, that at times just that the confusion is just around, it's so obvious in a sense that a lot of the world's suffering is based in these narratives, these limited type of narratives, and you can see it. And like you were talking about earlier, it's like you know, um, you know, after some things happened, I was able to come to this understanding that the search for what this is through the kind of, like, I could see very clearly that we're that there's this limited type of mind that's attempting to know what reality is through, physics or the, Western scientific method. And it is just so apparent that it cannot, what's doing the looking is what it's looking for in its limited form, and that it can never be known
Mhm.
through this kind of, limited, that just seems so apparent. And then it seems, if you would say that to people, to somebody who's just appears so much smarter than me and is able to, is a quantum physicist, and it's, or I don't know, I went off on a little ramble there, but yeah, it's difficult. It's
Well, you touched on something, at the outset about of what you were saying around kind of being sort of just growing up, being sort of given certain narratives and frameworks to believe in a sense, or this being told by our primary caregivers and the society, and that this is the way it is, and that's driven by lots of things because there's lots of different views out there. We could say there's some sort of shared consensus reality views around that there's time and space and cause and effect that seem pretty universal across cultures.
mhm.
But then there's very specific sort of narratives around whether they're religious, spiritual ones or more materialistic, atheistic ones or whatever, right? So, yeah, so there's no question that an aspect of of this investigation that I'm inviting is one of recognizing that whatever the frameworks are that we have grown up in and believing in as a function of our particular karma, our life stream, are we have the inquiry I'm inviting is one that also involves sort of questioning those narratives for sure. But what I suggest is, rather than sort of trying to refute the narratives at the level of the narratives to show that they're wrong, just go to your experience that the narratives are supposedly defining, right, and explaining, and we can begin to discover that that experience itself deviates from the narratives. It just shows us something else. I mean, the principal human narrative that there's a subject in a world of objects, right, that we all just take for granted, right? Whatever our religious, spiritual, cultural traditions might be, that narrative can be discovered to not hold up under scrutiny by just looking at your experience. See if you can find a subject in a world of objects experientially. As a concept, oh yeah, I get that concept. And then that concept can seemingly become a kind of reality, like, oh yeah, I'm a subject in a world of objects. But just feel the moment right now. And do you feel a subject in a world of objects, or do you just feel experience? Where's the subject and object? So there is experience basically showing you that the narratives are incomplete. They're not the whole story, however valid they may be from within their own frameworks.
Mm.
And, you know, to Karen's question, that can be confrontive, you know, when we have an understandable investment in the frameworks and narratives, because they bring us a sense of knowledge and a sense of, hey, I know what's going on here. I can orient now to reality because I have a map. I can find my way around, right? Because I know where I am. It's like, that can feel challenging to have that called into question by looking at experience. But we can kind of discover, I like to say, you can ultimately have your cake and eat it too, because you can see through the frameworks and realize they don't hold up under scrutiny, and you can still make use of them. You know, you can still have maps, and you can still have language and descriptions, and you can still have a sense of being a person in a relationship with another person.
Well, to me, too, a lot of it is what's the lens you're looking
Mm-hmm.
at it through.
Mm-hmm.
Are you looking at just this lens, or are you looking at it from this big giant lens?
Right.
And that's what you just said, is that we need to live in this world and, you know, pay our bills on time, and, you know,
Right.
fix breakfast when we're hungry, and
Right.
and those kinds of things. But we also can be very much aware of being in the big world.
Yes.
And that I find to be very comforting and helpful. And sometimes science even helps with that,
Mm-hmm.
with something like, I know that in physics there is no such thing as cold. There's
Mm-hmm.
only heat.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just a measurement of heat. We're never cold. It's just
Right.
how much heat do we have?
Exactly.
And
That's the same idea of everything exists on a continuum. There's not actually discrete colors. There's a continuum of light, right? Yeah, same thing. I mean, it's amazing. But and that you're right. And it can be useful, you know, as a way of languaging our experience and communicating about it, to say, like, I'm cold now. You know, are you? You know, but if you look at it, it's like, it's completely arbitrary, just like drawing the line around the wave. Like, at what point does cold become not cold? Or does hot become not? I mean, it's just a
well,
continuum.
and it depends on what you're wearing. It depends on where you're living. It
Absolutely.
depends on
Right. There's
what
that. Yeah. There's that whole aspect. But even any of the metrics are,
Right.
you know, it's like if you're, I think somewhere in the book I have a chapter about this, like the problem of measurement, and I use the same idea, where you're like, so you're in this state of like calmness, and then suddenly something makes you anxious. So like, where is the boundary line between calm and anxious? Like, you hit a point where suddenly you cross over into anxiety, and then when you're going from anxiety back to calmness, like, where is it's just a continuum. There's not discrete phenomena. It's wild, isn't it?
Mhm.
But feel the way in which, like, that the seamlessness is, they're not being two things. They're not being multiple things, is the peace that passeth understanding. It's complete equanimity and complete peace, because there's not two things. There's just
Mhm.
one thing.
One non-thing.
Right. Yeah. One non-thing that I can't call a thing or a non-thing, because I have no name for. But yes, that's the limits of languaging this stuff. It's impossible, right? But to try to say something about it, I mean, I could just not say anything, but but yes, you're right. It's not, you know, one of the problems with like sort of spiritual language, you know, where people will talk about, like, take the word God, and or freedom, or any notion, sort of spiritual notion, suggests that there's something other than that thing, which is why we have a name for it, right? Because if the names again suggest that there's a bounded limit to it. So it's kind of like the heat and cold thing. It's like, heat only as a concept only makes sense in terms of there being something that isn't heat. But if it's a continuum, there is no word for it, is there? Because there's nothing but the continuum.
We
So
call it temperature.
You could call it temperature, right? But that, what does that mean? You know, it's like,
Opposed to non-temperature.
yeah, right, right. So I like to say, you know, there ultimately is no God because there's only God. There's not something that falls outside of that totality.
Love what you said about the freedom of definition of things, true well-being, when you don't have to define. I love that.
Right. And it's a well-being that, again, doesn't have an opposite. It's the well-being that is the very nature of the totality. There's no lack of well-being in this well-being. There's only all pervading the expanse of well-being that is the fundamental nature of what's here. It's a well of being. It's a well of a deep, fathomless, bottomless well of this, of existence. The well of being, I call it. You know, it's interesting to me as a psychologist and trained as a psychologist, like that psychology, which is all about helping people to discover mental, emotional well-being, basically don't know anything about what I'm talking about. So it's one of the reasons I try to introduce it in my classes. Like, hey, here's a little alternative view on well-being. Check it out. It doesn't actually have to do with what you think it does, which is the presence of certain states that we identify with well-being and the absence of the states that we think are not well-being. This is a well-being that pervades all states, all phenomena.
It reminds me of the term bliss,
Mm-hmm.
or the translation of Ananda, which is so difficult to understand.
But I think that it's pointing to what I'm talking about. I mean, Sat Chit Ananda, that word, you know, or those three words, Sat is ever existent, Chit is ever conscious. So this which is also knows that it is clearly. And so Sat Chit and Ananda is that the bliss of that, the joy of that, the intrinsic well-being of the beingness of this, the knowing of this. And here we are, being it and knowing it right now. The moment is always, as I said at the outset of the little meditation, the moment is always being known. No matter how it looks. And knowing and being feel like they really are synonyms, you know, knowing and being. It's lovely to be with all of you. Thanks for joining me again, or for the first time, in case of some of you.
Thanks for doing this.
Yeah.
Happy holidays.
Yes, all the best to all of you. Take good care of yourselves.
Thanks.
And maybe see you another time.
Hope your dad gets a hospital room.
Thanks, Pam. I appreciate that. Yeah, I hope so too. Yeah.
Bye. Thanks.
Be well, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.